Hello and welcome. My name is Bruno Verchen and I work for the Jenkins project. Please don't hesitate to participate via Twitter by using this QR code. It should appear in most of the slides. And at the end of the presentation, we'll also be able to get a link to discuss my proposal in community.jenkins.io. But let's start with a flashback to my previous job. I'll spare you the description of the long evolution of our CI/CD system for mobile development and just give you a quick snapshot of where we were when I left. We were using GitLab CI and we offered a set of Docker images. We had a standard image with the latest version of all the tools, Maven and Gradle, Android SDK, Android NDK, Flutter, Firebase, linters, dependency checkers, and so on. And this image was in the cache of the runners, which is more or less equivalent to the Jenkins agents, so that the jobs could be started right away. There were also specific images with various versions of the tools or with specific tools added. We also had an Android device form linked to GitLab CI so that developers could test the freshly built app on real Android devices directly from their pipeline. I resigned last April and got a job in the Jenkins project, and when I got asked, would you like to replicate parts of what you did for mobile app developers with GitLab CI, but this time with Jenkins? And this way you would be able to learn about Jenkins while maybe helping future Android app developers already using Jenkins. LazyMe asked two questions. Does Jenkins work well with Docker? To which I got the honest answer, sort of. And the second question was, may I do everything from scratch, not looking elsewhere? I don't want to know what's working for Android app development with Jenkins. I want to try to build it with my old GitLab habits, even if that fails. To which my manager said, go for it. I know he's one of a kind, letting me reinvent a wonky squarish wicket wheel for the sake of growing knowledge. Keep in mind, the three goals of this exploration were experiment, learn, and share. Silly me was pretty confident this would be a cakewalk because after all, I was into mobile app CI/CD for more than 8 years. What could go wrong? To be honest, that has been quite a ride. So last April I knew nothing about Jenkins. I was a total newbie. I made every mistake a Jenkins newbie can make. So what to start with? An empty Android app for sure, but it's difficult to teach an old monkey a new trick, so what did I do first? I rebuilt headfirst an Android Docker image, trying to fit in all the tools I could think of, like the one I used to use with GitLab. And at the time, I had thought that I would be done in a few days. It's almost touching to see how naive I can be sometimes. And at the same time, I installed Jenkins thanks to Docker on my Windows laptop and tried a few tutorials with the simplest jobs possible that worked. And once I got my big, bulky, full of tools Docker image pushed to Docker Hub, I went on to the creation of the empty Android application. We would then connect the dots later on. So I created a new repo on GitHub, cloned it on my laptop, opened Android Studio and created a new application from scratch within that folder. I then committed everything and pushed that to GitHub and added a GitHub action file that we could see that application could be built outside of my machine. The QR code will lead you to the repo because yes, you can build a simple Android app directly with GitHub Actions. GitHub has Java and Android SDK in their Ubuntu latest image. So at this stage, my empty app could be built on Android Studio and with GitHub Actions. I had my APKs available on Android Studio and within GitHub Actions. That's nice. So I had a Jenkins controller running on top of Docker and a Jenkins agent also running on top of Docker on my laptop. But I couldn't get it to run my custom Android building Docker image. I now know this can be done. I also know I could have created a specific agent starting from the SSH agent Docker image and adding the Android SDK, but at the time, I absolutely wanted to keep my old habits, which are using my custom Docker images and generic agents. So, waiting for a solution to my issues under Windows, I then created two Jenkins agents on Oracle Cloud Free Tier machines and installed Java, Docker, and on top of that, a Jenkins agent handled by systemd. On one of them, I also installed the Android SDK so that it could build Android app. That's what I call my Jenkins droid. Then I created a simple Android job on Jenkins referencing my GitHub page, repo, and launched the build. And once my first Gradle command succeeded, I became more confident and added checks, bundle creation, and was left in the end with a long list of build steps in a FreeStyle project. At the time, I discovered that if for whatever reason my controller would restart, my current build would be gone. Pipeline jobs do not face a gone for eternity issue when your controller restarts, so I thought this was the way to go. I started with a small pipeline description, then it grew with more stages, more tools, static analysis, compilation of course, release creation, we'll see in a moment, unit testing, up to the moment where I lost everything. Of course, I told you my controller instance was on my Windows machine, running on top of Docker. And one day, as I was trying to make room for Android builds, I accidentally entered a Docker command that removed all the volumes, so I lost my jobs and their definition. It shouldn't have happened, but when you only have 0 byte left on your disk and that Docker desktop is frozen, strange things can happen. So be it. That was a time when I decided to store my Jenkins file in GitHub along the rest of my files. So each branch could then have its own pipeline with different tools, different agents, different Docker images, whatever. That proved convenient later on. But I said convenient and not perfect, because with the pros of getting one Jenkins file per branch comes also the cons of always getting the last commit on any branch to start a job and the impossibility of building explicitly the branch you chose. Because let's face it, anything can happen during a build or between two builds. A machine serving dependencies can be down or suffering, a link can be entirely broken, or a Docker image layer can go missing. Tons of bad things can happen. What can I do when the build on branch A failed because of a dependency missing and a build on branch B starting because it's the last commit on the project? For me, it was not a good idea to keep a simple pipeline project when using several branches. That's why I switched to multi-branch pipeline later on. But at this point, I had several branches, one Jenkins file per branch, and 3 tier machines struggling to stay alive because of the heavy load. I then thought, you know what, I have different Jenkins files on different branches because I'm testing different tools or different stages, so why should I keep the very same Docker image on all the branches? Couldn't I use different Docker image per branch, depending on the tools or the version of the tools I use? At the time it made sense, because if you only use a generic version of the Android Docker image, it will take time to download during a build the different versions of the tools which are not yet bundled in the default image. And what do developers want? Fast pipelines. And how can we implement that? By having a custom Docker image with all the right versions of the tools. But is this image in the Docker cache? No, it's not. So can we get fast pipelines? Of course we can get 5 minutes or so pipeline, but it all depends on the specificity of the agent. Is it attached to only one project? If that's the case, then we can hope that even for various versions of the Docker image, the Docker cache would be big enough that the build would fire up right away. So, I had a potential different Docker file per branch and an image per branch built per a GitHub action and put on my Docker Hub repo. And at that time, I had a working declarative pipeline per branch, one Docker image per branch too, and in the end, an application binary ready to be deployed. Ready, really? I could find the binaries in the workspace in a matter of a second, but there is no release, just binaries. There would be some manual steps to get this into a version release we can deliver to the test users, for example. Of course, we could create manually a release within GitHub and then copy-paste the binaries from Jenkins artifact archive to the GitHub release page. We could also do the same for the Google Play Store, but this is not efficient nor error-prone. Does it make sense to have a release on the GitHub repository at the same time as on Google Play? I think it really depends on the app and its audience, but for this talk, let's assume it's okay. So to automate the release, we have to decide what is a version number, how do we update the version number, and what makes a release. There's a Gradle plugin named Semantic Version that has a strict set of rules that will help us. You can use Gradle commands to increment the bytes version, the minor version of the major version. You can use classifiers like snapshot, beta, alpha, or any other version classifier that will help you define a version name. There's a Jenkins plugin called Git changelog that will merge all your commit messages so that you can produce a readable version of the changes, but that does not create the release. If you want to stay on the Jenkins side, there is no plugin for this, but of course, there are lots of different ways to do it. You can use the GitHub API to create a release, but you can also use a gh command, which can do all the heavy lifting for us. So, back to the drawing board, let's add the command to our Docker image. And once that's done, we have to use the GitHub app authentication in order to get GH to use our credentials. And to get it to work, you have to install the GitHub branch source plugin. And once it's done, you have to create a GitHub application. So, at that moment, I was able to query GitHub via GH to see if the release was already existing and create it if it wasn't. My choice was totally arbitrary. I shall create a release when the version ends with release, and a draft release when there is no suffix, and a pre-release when the version ends with alpha or beta. That's good enough for my use case. GH does a nice job of preparing a release changelog, so I'm relying on it. When we're not building on the main branch, the release is not finalized, so I can still tidy it up afterward. It's nice to be able to create a release as soon as it's needed, even when it's not really needed to. It looks like I may have gone a little too far with the automatic release creation, don't you think? Now, what about using that workflow to create a release, but this time on the Google Play Store? The version is already handled by the Semantic plugin. The release notes are more or less ready to go. We only have to find the right plugin to push to the Google Play Store. And we have a Gradle plugin for that, Triplet Play. So once you have your Google Play Store account, you have to register your app, to import EULA, to upload paperwork, and then to upload signed app. And as it's not signed yet, let's do it quickly. You can sign the application via the command line thanks to zipline and APK Signer, or thanks to Jar Signer if you're using a bundle instead of an APK. So first thing first, let's build an application bundle, then sign it. But you can also do it directly thanks to Gradle. So from now on, when you will create the bundle with Gradle, it will be signed. Self-signed, that is, which is not what we are aiming for. We still have to upload the icon, summary, screenshots, banner, lot of boilerplate thingies, and the next big thing is to create a GCP project. You have to enable the Android Publisher API for that project. You have to link your Google Play Developer account through the GCP project. You have to create a service account and a key. And once you got the key, you have to create an environment variable within Jenkins. And for that, we first have to install the environment injector plugin. And once it's done, we have to give the service account permissions to publish app on our behalf, and we're finally ready to publish our app thanks to Gradle on Jenkins. The Gradle task group publishing tells us we have a publish bundle task that uploads app bundles for all variants. And as we did not store the generated GKS from Google in the repo, we have to use a variable to hold the value. So on your machine, it would work with something like that. And on Jenkins, we will have to create a secret. So the secret will be available under the Android Publisher Credentials key. The triplet documentation tells us that we can set up a configuration in the build.gradle file, like that. So let's try that. And the documentation also says that we have to supply a release notes file. So for our use case, we'll use the internal track and start from the release note generated via the GH tool to produce a shorter version limited to 500 characters as specified by Google. Whew, are we done now? We now have an Android application that builds, that has static analysis, that is automatically pushed to GitHub and Google Play Store. What's left? With standard pipeline projects, Jenkins always builds a latest document, a modification in the repo, the latest branch where somebody committed and pushed something. Anything. So how are we supposed to relaunch the build for a branch that got no recent commit? As far as I know, we just can't. So to attain this goal, we have to switch to multi-branch pipelines. Now, I can decide which branch to build whenever I want or need to, and I can even see my PRs building, and when I create a new branch, I automatically get a new build associated with it. I can tweak each Jenkins file for each branch and even use a different Docker image for each branch. And if ever my pipeline fails because of a missing dependency or because of a failure in the Docker image building, I can still relaunch the build when the issue is solved. I can also build the Docker image locally on the agent with the right tags so that my agents pick the right one without delay. At the time, I wondered if having a generic Docker agent was such a good idea for my use case. Most of my branches were using the same tools, even the same versions of the tools, and the major difference being one more tool or one more environment variable. Shouldn't I use a big Docker image with all the tools and variables and make that into a dedicated Android agent and declare a second agent that would be responsible for other Docker needs, like a specific Docker image? What was the aim of this project after all? Wasn't it just to build a proof of concept to see if an Android app could be easily built with Jenkins? With a bonus, which is that someone could later on try it on his own without much effort. I was not looking for designing the perfect Jenkins Android build farm, so why get a generic Docker agent to do everything? Shouldn't we use something less generic and more pragmatic? I let that sink in for a few weeks. And later on, I lost my Jenkins controller configuration, but the Jenkins file. So why not do it in another way and store in the SCM too? I then moved to Docker Compose and configuration as code. Yes, I had previously encountered some problems when running Jenkins in Docker on Windows, but it went way more smoothly with Docker Compose. You can easily share volumes if needed, expose ports, and define precisely what you need in a more explicit way than a bunch of Docker commands with cryptic arguments. You will just need one command to launch the whole Jenkins system, and you will be able to restart just a part of this system with the same command by adding just one explicit argument. And furthermore, this has been tested with Windows, Ubuntu, macOS, x86 and ARM and Vagrant, and it works. You know what's next, don't you? Of course, I went headfirst and exported the whole configuration as a base to work on. That was not the best idea I ever had. So after a while, I started from scratch, and with some help, I got a working JCasc minimal system, and then I made a few iterations until I got something interesting. I was pretty happy with that until I realized jobs were not part of that JCasc export-import. I had to use the poor man's JCasc, which is basically copy and paste files and folders from the running Jenkins controller. So it's just a matter of getting the content of var Jenkins home and then take only what you're interested in, the jobs in my case. So once you got the files, you only need to modify the Docker files that these jobs are now part of the controller image. Okay, now I have a Jenkins system that I can replicate just about anywhere. An app that builds on top of it with the associated jobs and that can be deployed to GitHub and Google Play Store. What's next? It wouldn't make sense to release an application that has not been tested yet, because I know in theory we've done quality assurance and we'll do unit testing in a while, so all should go fine, except that we don't live in theory. There are two major kinds of testing, as you know: unit testing, for which you don't need a real or emulated device, and instrumented testing, where you need some kind of Android device available. Because let's face it, an app is incomplete until it's tested on devices, real devices, that is, target devices if they exist for your application. What do Android developers do when they want to test? They have their own device connected to their laptop if the project has a tight budget. They're also using the default Android emulators, or they use a remote device farm if they are lucky. When you install the Android SDK, you can create emulators on the fly, but it's not trivial within Docker, and especially under Windows, because you need nested virtualization and specific kernel modules. The emulator we're using is an official image from Google with a recent version of Android. So to summarize, we have defined in that Docker Compass file a controller, an Android agent, a generic Docker agent, an emulator, and we can now run these commands. I'm sure you already see the obvious limitation that with that way of doing things. What will happen when one PR will ask for a build at the same time as a branch building after a commit and push? Of course, we can't access the same emulator at the same time, trying to install two different versions of the same application and launching tests on this application. This proposal is flawed by design. Remember, this exploration is a proof of concept, and it's in no way something you could copy and paste to production. But I already can see some eyebrows raising. Of course, we have some Jenkins experts in here. There's a plugin for that. It's just a matter of declaring a new lockable resource in Manage Jenkins, Configure System, Lockable Resource Manager, and you're good to go. The next step is to use a lock with the right name in your Jenkins file, and it just works, and with JCask too. The problem we have is our proof of concept may test different versions of the application at the same time on the same device. We created a bottleneck with the lockable resource. And you saw it coming, we could add some more emulators, but who would handle the load balancing? A device farm, maybe? STF is a device farm, and its principal feature is to handle a bunch of real Android devices and to lend them to projects wanted to test on devices. And this farm also works with emulators, so that's something I'll definitely implement soon. And it can also work with a real device linked to your Windows or Linux machine thanks to Docker, so that you could test your application on your own device through CI. I can brag. I do brag. Yeah, I got a working job that builds and publishes an application thanks to Jenkins. Yes, I got a working job that builds and publishes an Android application thanks to Jenkins on my machine. Would it work on yours? As they say, sharing is caring, and I do care for mobile app developers and people who want to get involved into CI/CD for mobile applications, so I have to share. How could you replicate my work at home? At work? I already told you my Docker Compose file worked under Windows, macOS, Linux, Vagrant. That's pretty nice, but would it work in the park on your ARM64 Chromebook? Did you hear correctly? Did I really say Chromebook? Can you get it to work on your cheap ARM64 Chromebook? Would that Docker Compose file work for you on your Chromebook? Maybe. What about trying that on your own laptop? Even if I don't really like to mix my Android application with my Jenkins setup, you could get my proposal up and running on any machine on your herd in a few minutes. You just have to fork my repo and enter this Docker Compose command in the Jenkins door. Of course, before entering that command, you should have created a GitHub app, installed it on your fork, have a Google Play developer account, have the right credentials with you, and copy all of that in a .env file in your local copy of the fork or clone in the Jenkins dir. Now, what about getting something beefier than the free tier and even easier to set up? Something that would give you enough disk space, RAM, power to test my proposal. Something that would work at the click of a button. Something as free as it gets. Something that could also work on your Chromebook or on your smartphone, your Steam Deck, or even your car entertainment system. Here comes GitPod. It spins up for you fresh, automated dev environment for each task, in the cloud, in seconds, or, depending on the project, minutes. It's free as long as you don't use it more than 50 hours a month and works with GitLab, GitHub, or Bitbucket. It continuously builds your Git branches like a CI server that you can start CRUDing right away. It works on my machine, yes, but it works on your machine too. And each of you could do it right here, right now, with my repo from your phone or computer thanks to the QR code. You could have your own Android Jenkins instance running within your browser 2 minutes from now. Okay, you got it. It's not running at all in your browser. You just have access to the container running all of that through your browser. Isn't it fantastic? That's the catch. As you may have seen in the README, you have to import a .env file that contains the credentials for it to work up to the end. So if you try it right here, right now, Jenkins will start for you. You will be able to build the app, but you won't be able to publish the Android app as you won't have the right credentials, hopefully. Why did I entitle this section the GitPod Lament? Isn't everything working as expected? Sort of. GitPod is not a VM in your browser, you already got it. It's a Docker container somewhere in the cloud. And if you want to use Docker in it, it works. But if you want to use Docker on Docker in it, it fails. It means you would use Docker on Docker in Docker. There are tons of things to do to make this project more usable and more up-to-date with good practices, but to do so I will need you. Of course, I do my part, remove my blinkers, and I will now seek for information to know how others do. I need your help. I need to hear your point of view. I want to know what you're doing for Android and Jenkins and how you're doing it and what is missing from your point of view. I'd love it if the community gathers and finds a solution to build mobile app thanks to Jenkins. And now that you know what we could do for Android developers, we could also try to address what iOS developers face when trying to use CI/CD. Because getting Android apps to build with Jenkins was kind of challenging for me. But iOS, oh my, that's a whole different story. Thanks a lot for your attention and see you on community.jenkins.io to get your feedback on this solution and some inputs on yours.